what a lot of people call arranging or creating an arrangement can be hard because of the way we describe it. The word arranging or creating an arrangement itself is part of the problem. Arranging is essentially describing a functional process. And in order to know if what you're doing is good, you need to know a lot about that functional process. So someone needs to tell you, all right, so here's how you arrange something. X, Y, Z, right? So let's say you're on a factory line, and you're not. This is the whole point with music. You're not on a factory line, but let's say you're on a factory line and someone says, right, you've got to make this thing. You've got to do this thing. And then they don't tell you what to do. We're like, well, I've got no way of knowing whether what I'm doing is good. So you get told do A, B, and C. And once you've done that, then it's done. A functional process has been described to you. But the fact that it's only a functional process means that the way that you measure whether it's good or not is if you have achieved the steps of that process. That is the only way of measuring the quality. So in other words, if you think of what you're doing as a functional process, what you're going to end up doing is making music that follows the rules, making music that just does the official things that you are supposed to do. Now, there's nothing wrong necessarily with music that follows the rules. There's nothing wrong with music that does a functional thing. But if that's it, then you're going to end up making possibly generic music, possibly very dull and lifeless music, possibly music which doesn't express something about your experience or about you, something that doesn't mean something. In other words, if you say to yourself that what I am doing is insert functional process. So what I'm doing is I'm arranging, or what I'm doing is mixing, or what I'm doing is mastering, then essentially you have to be an expert at the functional things in order to know whether it's good or not. But what if you're not an expert? How many musicians have made great music before they could be said to be experts? Loads. How have they done that? They've done that by focusing on something else. They've done that by focusing on the why. Why do you do this functional process? This is the problem I have with the word arrangement or arranging or describing what you're doing as these functional processes, is that there's no point beyond I've got to make a verse and now I've got to make a chorus. And now the book says that I have to have another verse and then a bridge and then a chorus. And then I will have finished a song. Really? So, you may well have finished a song, but is it a good one? Does it express something? Why? Why does this song exist? What we want to start doing is thinking of arranging as serving a much greater, higher, deeper, more important purpose. And that's what we're doing. Arrangement is simply a functional process we're using to serve the purpose. So when we come out of the previous stage of the creative process, which in the music machine I call discovery, other people have other words for it, like Rick Rubin. If you read his book, he has exactly the same stages of the creative process in his book, The Creative Habit. It's either The Creative Habit or The Creative Act. I can't remember. But the Rick Rubin book, when I read it, I was like, what? That's incredible. It literally describes splurge, discover, draft, done. But it describes all of but with different words. I think he calls splurge, what I call splurge, the seed or something. So anyway, the previous stage before what we're doing now, before we are arranging, or what I call drafting, is discovery. So out of discovery, ideally, it doesn't always work like this, but ideally, we would have the purpose of the piece, right? What is this piece expressing? Not the function of the piece, not will this piece make people dance, or will this piece help somebody jog faster or focus or whatever it is, but the purpose, what you are expressing through the music, the emotion or the story. So ideally, out of discovery, we have discovered the purpose of the piece, the why, the main sections of the piece which express the purpose, and within those sections, the main parts which express the purpose, ideally. However, out of discovery, because discovery is a very idea-generating thing, it's a very divergent part of the process where we're just trying stuff and we're throwing stuff at the wall, out of discovery, quite often, these ideas, these sections, these parts aren't arranged so that they are, number one, clear. Quite often when I listen to people's music, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be listening to. Number two, that they feel satisfying, that the sections arrive somewhere, that it has a moment where you're like, ah. These sections often don't seem to have a direction. It's just a kind of jumble of sections, right? We've got this section, we've got that section. So it's like they're not going anywhere. And often out of discovery as well, these sections don't create impact. It's very like that because we've just been throwing stuff at the wall and we've been figuring stuff out. The way that they're arranged can either be extremely chaotic or not chaotic and just not have clarity. They don't feel satisfying. They're not going in a certain direction and they don't create impact. How can we do this in arrangement? When we're drafting, when we're creating an arrangement, what are the tools that we can use to make it clear, satisfying, have direction, and create impact? In order to make a piece of music clear, what we need is structure. So what structure means is sections in an order. Now that structure can be a time-honored, well-worn order of sections. So verse, chorus, middle eight, chorus, for example. There's nothing wrong with that. But it doesn't have to be. Because we're working to purpose, purpose allows us to create a different structure. So for example, in one of the tracks that I finished recently, there is no real chorus. It sort of goes verse and then chorus-like thing that has a repeated refrain, and then verse and chorus-like thing that has a repeated refrain. Why am I allowed to do that? Why is that better than verse, chorus, middle eight, verse? You know, why is it better than that? Because this particular piece of music was expressing me feeling uncertain and stuck, never arriving. So in other words, the structure may well follow the rules. And it would if you were just focusing on function. But by focusing on purpose and making the structure reflect the purpose, you can have a very clear structure that breaks all of the rules if you want, if that's what serves the purpose. Now, how do we make this structure of sections feel satisfying? What we have in music is tension and release. So over and within the sections, we create tension and release it. And a very quick way of thinking about tension, there are other ways of doing it as well, but a very quick way of thinking about tension is that when you're creating tension, you are violating an expectation. So when I stopped speaking then, you were like, what is that? Is the thing stopped? Is it? Right? Because you expected me to say something and I didn't. So in other words, I took something away that you were expecting, or I didn't do something that you were expecting. So think about how that relates to making music, how you can do that in making music. Essentially, very quick way of thinking about this is if you create an expectation by having a part, right, or a section, people expect, and then you don't do that or you take it away, you will be creating tension. So tension is about taking things away, and then releasing that tension is about bringing them back. Creating tension is about violating an expectation. Releasing that tension is about fulfilling the expectation. So we have a structure and we're creating tension and release. But it's still, even if we have those two things, we still might not be going in it could just be kind of random tension and release. So how do we think about creating a direction that we're going somewhere? I hesitate to say taking them on a journey because that's so cliched, but it's like people feel like they're being taken somewhere, like going somewhere. They're in safe hands or surprising hands even, or shocking hands, depending on the artist, right? But they're being taken. It's like there's this purpose literally to it. It's what I call arc. So what I mean by arc is, we were talking about tension and release. The arc is the shape of that tension through each section and over the whole piece. Because if we just think about sections on their own, so in other words, if we only think about structure, we can end up in a very dull and lifeless piece of music. It's just like verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus. It's like the factory worker again, just making another widget. That's not what we're doing. What we want is that structure to have a shape in and over it. So within that verse, maybe the tension builds. Yeah, and then in the chorus, it's released. But then the tension into the final chorus is much bigger. And then we get the final payoff, the final release in the final chorus. So we want to have an arc that changes over the whole piece of music and within each section as well. So that's the difference between structure and arc. And then finally, to create impact, what we need to leverage, one of the biggest tools in our toolbox as musicians, is contrast. What is contrast? Contrast is the relative difference between sections or parts within sections. And when I say relative difference, you might say, difference between what? Well, exactly. Yes. I mean, almost anything. Volume, texture, type of sound, brightness, muddiness. Yes, it is all right to be muddy in a piece of music if it serves the purpose. Right. This is why I don't like words like polish and refine, because sometimes we don't want it to be polished and refined because we're describing something that isn't polished and refined. So contrast is the relative difference between either the sections, so you might have a really quiet and verse and then a chorus, or even within between sections and parts. When we're arranging, what we're doing is we're using structure to be clear about where we are in the piece. We're using tension to make it feel satisfying, like something is happening. We're creating that kind of feeling of release. We're creating direction by using the shape of the tension to create an arc, and we're creating impact by using contrast. In other words, arranging is just the process of making a draft of a piece with structure, tension, arc, and contrast. Arranging is simply a functional process in order for us to do the much more important thing, to serve the purpose. In other words, the why.